All right, we will start, and as others trickle in, they will just have to catch up. But anyway, good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, depending on where we find you today in the world. But thank you for joining us for Orr Group Talks. This is our first one of 2023, and I'm really excited. We're going to get to chat with Janiece and have a really good conversation. But just give you a little orientation to some of the do's and don'ts and tech of all this. My name is Craig with Orr Groups or the Orr Group, and excited that you've joined us. We really see this as an opportunity for us to share with you the people and thought leaders that we find interesting. We're really fortunate in the work we do. We get to work with lots of great people and meet lots of great people. And Janiece is one of those I think is particularly special. So we're happy to use this forum to share with you. A couple of housekeeping notes. The bathrooms are located now. I don't know wherever you are, you should know where the bathrooms are. But for our purposes, if you want to submit questions, which we would love to have you participate and do so, you'll see on the bottom of your box, there's a thing that says Q&A. Please submit your questions there. We'll get them and we'll try and work them in as we go. Also, at the bottom of the screen, you'll see the chat function. At this point, we're all pretty familiar with Zoom and how this all works, but you can use that if you have any tech issues where you just want to introduce yourself to everybody else. You can use the chat. But if you've got questions that you'd like us to address in the conversation, please put them in that Q&A. That just be a little bit easier for me to try and keep an eye on one place as opposed to another. I think those are all the housekeeping notes. What I would just say is, again, we're really excited to have Janiece work with us and be with us here today. Give you a little orientation to her background, which you probably know, but she's the CEO at Tides. We're going to hear a lot more about Tides. I think it's fascinating because I think each of us probably knows pieces of it, but very few of us see the whole thing. But they've really had a long-standing commitment to social justice, but really under Janiece's leadership have really focused in on, how can they strengthen the power of BIPOC community leaders. And it's just been a really interesting time for that part of philanthropy, and Tides has really, led the way on that. But also, I just think Janiece has a super interesting background. We first got to meet when she was at Fossil, and she really was doing corporate philanthropy in a very different way than I'd seen it done. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But then she also worked in the regular for-profit world prior to that. So just has a really great background, and I think it's a lot of insights that I think we'll all appreciate. So welcome, Janiece. Without further ado, I will jump right into what I think is going to be a great conversation. Why don't we start with your career, right? So again, as I just said, it's a little bit unique. I sort of fell into nonprofits early in my career. It took you a little bit longer to get here, but how did you get here? I don't see a world in which, you were growing up in Oakland thinking, I want to work in philanthropy when I grow up. I got to assume, when I was growing up in Queens, I don't think I ever even heard about philanthropy, but tell us a little bit about your background and how it brought you to Tides.
Well, thank you. Let me first just say I'm truly honored, Craig, to reconnect with you. It's been a minute, so thrilled that we're going to have this conversation today. And I do want to say thank you to all who have joined in today. A special shout out to our Tidesters. So I know quite a few of my teammates are joining this call as well. So I'm honored to share, it's not just my story, but our story. And I do sometimes say I have a non-traditional path of landing in this space. I'm often asked, or introduced as being a philanthropist. And I'm like, oh, is that what I am? I consider myself a social impact leader, absolutely, but do I consider myself a philanthropist? And I sometimes say philanthropy is our business model, but I'm really focused on the work. And, in terms of my path of getting here, I'm very mindful of say, my background and my family's background that truly did influence this trajectory in terms of how I got here and my why. And one of the things I often speak to in terms of the work and the work we do is really, what's your why? And so I'm mindful of my parents' background growing up in the South. I don't often share, but I too was born in the South, in Arkansas, to be specific. But my dad and my mom both went through that era of integration, thinking about the 50s, if you will. And so I share this because I think it truly did kind of plant the seed in terms of my view about social justice and racial justice in particular. But my dad was in high school at a time, let's say 1959 or so, where in his city, they were no longer going to bus the Black students to the neighboring city to an all-Black school. So his junior year, he was forced to go to a high school in his town that was predominantly white. And I think we can all assume that that was not a good experience for him. And so he had told his parents he was not going to return his senior year. He was going to drop out if he was going to be forced to go back to that school. So that actually led him to move to Northern California. Berkeley was already fully integrated at that time. So here he was, a 17-year-old kid who had the opportunity to move to Berkeley, California to live with his brother to complete high school. And so I share that because there's many of those stories, I think, that have influenced who I am, including my grandmother on my mother's side, who dropped out of high school in 8th grade to take care of her siblings because her mother passed, right? So I'm mindful that I'm talking not even, generations before me, that my work that I do really is a breakthrough for my family. And so my path of getting here, I sometimes say, is very non-traditional. I've had a host of experiences growing up in Richmond, California, experiences I had in the public school system, where at an early age, I realized that life is not fair, right? And it's one of those seeds that my parents planted in me, is that life isn't fair, and didn't really understand what that meant. And then moving forward, I was at Berkeley in the 80s during the South African apartheid movement, right? So very enlightened as well in terms of not only what was happening here in the US, but also understanding social and racial justice on a more global scale. And then fast forward to my career, I started at HP in the 80s in Silicon Valley. And as I now sometimes unpack kind of how I got there and why, it wasn't that I was enamored with high tech, but I understood the power of technology to really create change and to change, right, the quality of life for many. And so when I started at HP, I will honestly say it wasn't that I was enamored with technology. I was more enamored with the power of technology, if you will. And so early on, figured out my way there, was truly on the marketing side in terms of promoting, selling products, et cetera. But I was always still very engaged in other work that the company was doing in terms of community impact, right? And so early on, as a 20-something-year-old employee, I immediately expressed my interest of knowing more about the company's footprint around community impact. Again, I didn't speak to it as philanthropy. What I cared about is, how are you showing up in community? And so even early, I think I had been there a couple of years, I was asked to join the recruiting team at UC Berkeley. So I share these seeds that truly kind of impacted my why. But I remember early on, I was asked, hey, can you join our recruiting team, for UC Berkeley? And I'm like, okay, why? My alma mater, and yeah, another way I can contribute. And the ask was because we're not attracting students of color or women. I'm like, okay, wow. And so the fact that I ended up at HP, upon graduation, says there are obviously others there like me who would find HP of interest and value. So joined the recruiting team when, at a recruiting fair on campus, and immediately saw the aha. Here's why you're not attracting students who look like me. Well, the entire recruiting team was white male, right? So guess what? Women, students of color probably aren't going to look twice, right? And so I say that because even then, that little bit of information was quite pivotal in terms of our ability to start recruiting students of color and women. And then, so forth. My role then was really to continuously inform and educate such that others could come on board. So I continued my path, at HP, but a real breakthrough for me, I was, heavily involved in marketing, pretty much touched every customer segment known to man in terms of the work that I was leading. But one of the breakthroughs in my career was doing it depending on the audience and their history or their knowledge of technology or Silicon Valley and HP. Some will remember the Carly Fiorina era. There are many chapters and eras at HP. Let me just say, when I was there, I experienced 4 different CEOs, but there was one CEO in particular who many people come to understand or know was Carly Fiorina. And the significance of that is that it was also during a time when this whole era discussion about digital divide was emerging. And so as a lot of wealth was being created in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, as we know, there were many communities, Black and brown communities, that were falling further behind. And it was such a stark reality, especially here in the Bay Area, where just across the highway, right, we had this community, East Palo Alto, right, in our backyard, that truly was not growing and prospering in the same way as many of the other communities in Silicon Valley. And so I share that because that was really my on-ramp into the type of work I do now. And at the time, and I do share this, and especially for all parents, I was on parental leave at the time, had just had my first child, and had the audacity of checking my email. So please know, everyone, don't check email when you're on parental leave, but I did. And I saw this job posted for the inclusion executive. And when I read it, I was like, oh my goodness, this is my dream job, right? And this was a job at HP where they wanted someone with experience from the business side who had worked with customers to actually lead a new initiative and investment in East Palo Alto, where we were going to test and pilot new solutions, technology solutions to help the community bridge the digital divide. And I was like, oh my goodness, this is my dream job, right? Taking my years of experience working with customers and to actually now use those to bring my community forward. And so good news is I got the job, and that really did pave the way for the type of work I do now. Good news is the work went incredibly well, or so well, in that we actually did scale that particular pilot into a global initiative, or first national and then global. But that's when I also knew, in terms of my own why, that just making money was not good enough for me, right? So the good news is I had the support of HP, in terms of my career, but I also knew then is that my why really now has to be about how do I impact my community in a system changing way. And so after that chapter, I actually went back on the P&L side at HP and got a promotion. Promotions are good, always good. Let me just say that, to lead a new business unit. But I also knew then that I needed to work on my exit strategy, right? In terms of doing what I knew was truly my true north in regards to social impact and social justice. And so soon thereafter, I left the company. Fast forward, as you well know, Craig, when you met me, ended up in Dallas, Texas. So sometimes marriage does all kinds of things for us. And so this was my opportunity to support my husband in his promotion, if you will. But while I was in Dallas, I actually had a lot of incredible opportunities in the social impact space. And so one of those is at Fossil, when I was at Fossil Group, which is when you and I met. I had the opportunity to actually start the company's philanthropic arm from the ground up, and also their social impact strategies, right? And it's rare that you have an opportunity to actually move into a company, for-profit company, Fortune 500, let alone, and actually start something from the ground up. So I appreciate you saying that I created, or my team and I, because it truly is a team sport, something that you may not have seen before, because my intention was not just to do more of the same. And I say that, and we'll talk in a minute about the work we're doing at Tides, but it truly is about system change and how are we going to seriously move the needle in terms of social justice. And so the opportunity my team and I had was to create a different approach to philanthropy, corporate philanthropy in particular. And soon thereafter, I think, my role expanded to also lead environmental impact in addition to social impact. And then more importantly, kind of the intersectionality of those. So that really did pave the way. And there's a host of other opportunities I've had on that journey, including a lot of the work that I do as well on boards. So some of my work, a lot of my work is also informed. I'm a lifelong learner. And so my team, very well, they're like, you're not on another board, are you? And I have to say that too, my board knows in particular. I got to pump the brakes sometimes, but I will say I'm a lifelong learner. And I do look for best practices and new practices in the space, because I also know when I joined Tides in 2021 and was on the interview path, if you will, in 2020, we all know what 2020 presented in terms of the pandemic, racial reckoning, and I say that in quotation marks, because for many of us, it didn't take 2020 in terms of what was really going on in our community. But I say that because as I was then on this path to interview for the opportunity at Tides, I was tired of being sick and tired, right? And so one of the things I shared with the board at the time, right, is that I'm unapologetic, right, about the energy that I'm bringing and the commitment to this work. And so if this is more of the same, right, then I'm probably not the person for you. And let me just say, sometimes we get it right and sometimes we get it wrong. But I know my commitment that this is not just a job, right? And I say that and I share that on behalf of all of our Tidesters. They don't come to Tides just for a job. They come because of this real commitment, this authentic commitment in terms of social justice.
That's great. I appreciate you sharing your story. It's always remarkable to me when you think of like just kind of how short our American story is, and like it's within a generation or two, you go from like literally, I guess to some degree, we're still migrating around the country for reasons that we shouldn't. But anyway, that's super interesting. And I would say, in terms of pumping the brakes on boards, I did hear that you just recently joined the board for our good friends at Echoing Green, and I think
Yes.
also Cheryl is one of the participants. So I'm glad you didn't pump the brakes just yet. But
You knew there was no way I was going to say
no.
no. Yeah, you knew there was no way I was going to say no to that one. She's been a true thought partner for at least 5 years and a true sister friend. So there was no way I was going to say no to that.
Well, that's good. We're excited to have you on that team as well. So let's talk a little bit about Tides. I mean, again, I sort of referenced a little at the beginning. I think you all have a sort of multifaceted beyond what most people think. I know we did some work with your team trying to incubate some ideas of doing some things in the Caribbean and see what we can learn from that. And it just sort of opened my eyes like, oh, I don't know, Tides was into stuff like that too. So tell us a little bit about the organization and kind of where it is and where you see it going.
Well, thank you. And you're correct, right? And even when I came on board, and I was incredibly excited and am now even more excited about the work we've done and the work we will be doing. And so what we often say is that we have an opportunity to build upon what's great. We're a 47-year-old organization. Our founder, Drummond Pike, is still very passionate about the work that we do as well. But it's interesting because as I joined, there was a commitment to kind of reimagine our strategic impact, our strategy, right? But more importantly, our impact model and the type of change that we want to create in the world. And I say that because, to your point, there were a myriad of different interpretations of who we are, Tides, right? So if you're someone who's worked with us through the Tide Center, you knew us for fiscal sponsorship. If you're someone who's worked with our foundation team, you might know us for donor advised funds. If you're Google or Salesforce, one of our corporate partners, you know us for our grant making, right? So there's a myriad of different experiences, and everyone understanding that we had this vision of creating a world of shared prosperity and social justice. But there wasn't a clear understanding, okay, so what exactly does that mean, right? So even though there are issue areas where we would double click on, such as human rights, climate justice, environmental justice, education, et cetera, that might look and feel very different depending on your on-ramp into Tides, right? And so the opportunity that we've now created, we've gone through a strategic planning effort during the last year and a half, and really excited about this next chapter. And as I said, building upon what's great. But this next chapter is how do we, and we're mindful we're an intermediary. We work with the donors and we work with the doers, right? But what role can we play in shifting and strengthening power, right? And when we speak to that, right, in terms of shifting power, strengthening power, how do we do that in support of proximate leaders, especially those who are Black and Brown, who are closest to the problems in their respective communities? So we have a new vision that we will be sharing this year, all approved by the board, new mission, which will also be approved, but it really now is that intention of shifting and strengthening power, right? And so that will show up in everything we do, right? It truly is a journey. So our corporate partners will be on that journey with us. Our donor advised funds, our donors, if you will be on that journey with us. And most importantly, those on the ground, those who are leading the change already through Tide Center, our fiscally sponsored projects, will be on that journey with us, right? So we think there's a responsibility and a commitment that we owe to the sector of how are we going to be more intentional, right, about really creating that system change that we've all been talking about.
That's exciting times, and I look forward to hearing about and seeing the vision and the mission as it evolves. One of the things that I've found interesting is I've looked at, this idea of proximate leaders, right? You've really been, on the front line of moving to the front lines, right? And sort of being, okay, whether I remember after Roe, and I think we emailed about this, like I was just, when that decision was overturned, a lot of money sort of flowed into that space, but you all were very active in sort of saying, okay, like we want to flow money to community-focused, community-led reproductive rights organizations. And then even the way like you address climate change, like, we're trying to look at the actual communities affected and sort of push the money and the attention there. Talk a little bit more about that approach. Why is that sort of the thing that you see as sort of integral to actually making change? So sort of focusing on more proximate sort of leaders and approach.
Yeah, we have a value and a belief, right, of how do we help build capacity, right, and capability in regards to those on the front line. And one of the ways you do that is to move the resources to them as quickly as possible. So we have an initiative or a practice, I'd like to call it, called Goya, get off your assets, right? So I love that. That's one of the incredible practices that our foundation team created is how can we help our partners move resources faster, right? One of the other things we do really well too is understanding where are their gaps, right? Not replicating necessarily, but where do we have some superpowers or core capabilities to help move those resources faster, right? And so the great news is given the role we play as an intermediary, we have a breadth of partnerships, as you can imagine, right? Whether that's on the donor side or whether those are organizations on the ground, right? So the opportunity for us to move faster, right, is to understand the needs and be able to coalesce and collaborate quickly to make things happen and to move those resources. So hence, as you mentioned, the reproductive justice opportunity that was in front of us. And we also have several other what we call collective action funds of making that happen. We have a healthy democracy fund, right, where we have the same opportunity. We have several other funds. We lead, where we're able to equip women, Black women on the front lines of climate change, right, to get resourced quickly. So one of our opportunities, we don't have an endowment, right, but is to get our partners, our donors, to move off those assets faster, right? So that is, when we think about the future of this work and strengthening power, shifting power, that will be even more significant for us, is being able to identify needs quickly and to respond as well, right? And so as we hear conversations about trust-based, et cetera, right? And sometimes I cringe because that implies there isn't trust. And when we say there isn't trust, there's certain communities or leaders we haven't trusted, right? How do we change that system, right? Where basically, hey, this is what it means to be a good philanthropic partner, right? This is what it means to be a great social impact partner, right? Is to support and uplift and equip those on the front lines that are doing this work.
That's fantastic. And I think I want to come there. We have a question in the chat I'm going to come to in a second. And again, others, if you have questions, put them into the Q&A and I'll work them in. But before I go there, do you think we all, like, as a sector, have the attention span to deal with these things, right? When you talk about race, systems changing sort of the very structure and power of leadership, I don't know, we're really good at let's raise a bunch of money and have a Farm Aid concert, and then everybody moves on and forgets about Farm Aid. But I don't know, we're getting into hard things as a sector, which is great. But how do you think about that? Do we have the attention span to really stay with these issues and make a difference?
Craig, I'm a little provocative. So let me just say that I think it depends on who's the we, right?
Okay, I like that.
It depends on who's the we, right? If you're talking to me as a Black woman leader of Tides, yeah, I have the attention span because progress has been too slow, right?
Yep.
If you speak to our Black and Brown community, they're going to say, yeah, we have the attention span because progress has been too slow. So I think it depends on who the we is, and I share one of the things I even share in terms of my why coming to Tides is, as I mentioned before, when I was at HP, I led HP's Digital Divide Initiative in 2000. So when I was talking about the Carly Fiorina era, and I had the opportunity to come and start this global initiative called DE Inclusion. That was in 2000. Fast forward to the pandemic in 2020, and what was one of the top 2 issues that we were talking about in terms of our kids, especially our kids, having to attend school from home was the digital divide, right? So at the time, 20 years ago, when we, HP and others, there were a lot of us all who had dipped our foot into the whole digital divide conversation and thought we made some significant gains. 20 years later, it was the same problem. So to your point, right? Progress is slow and folks do move on, right? But I will say now, especially, I think there is a different understanding of real system change now, where systems have not changed, right? So those of us who are really in the social justice ecosystem still have a really strong appetite, incredibly strong appetite, and are looking at solutions, creating solutions differently. Are there others who have moved on? Yes. And I will say not one, but some of the painful conversations I've had as of late are with some of my close friends who are on the corporate side, and quote unquote, the debate, if you want to call it a debate, going on right now around DEI, right? As we've seen as of late, right? Lots of conversations in terms of quote unquote, the strength or not of DEI functions. I don't know what changed in the last 2 years. Why do we not need DEI anymore? I haven't seen a huge shift in terms of the diversity of many of my corporate partners. Little progress, right? So to say that folks move on, you know what I mean? I do think there are some who move on, right? But that addresses, or that's really rooted in the whole system issue that we're talking about as well.
Yeah, and I do think there is much more attention, understanding of systems and trying to make change at a systems level. I mean, even if you go back, I don't know, even 6-7 years ago when, like a Jeff Walker would talk about it, but like, it wasn't like the people weren't really sort of coming to it. I think now, even like you'll see the way, I mean, we first met kind of at Reform Organization, Peer Forward and College Summit, like you see the way that whole like part of the ecosystem has started to change. So I think you're right. People are realizing systems change, they're getting it in a different way. Some of us will have the attention span, and I guess we just have to hold everybody else accountable. But so you referenced your identity as a leader of color. I'm curious, leader of color, relatively new CEO, though time is sort of a weird flat circle at the moment because it's actually not that new. When you were like, no, I moved back to San Francisco in 2021. I'm like, yeah, that actually was a while ago. But anyway, so relatively new, but also facing into issues so sort of central to your own identity, right? Central to the underfunding of leaders of colors in organizations. Like, talk a little bit about your experience coming into this role as a CEO, as you. What has that been like?
As me. And what I actually say now, I'm starting my junior year.
All right. I like that.
A couple of years, and I've used that analogy with our board. My freshman year, I was truly deer in the headlights, right? Crazy excited about the opportunity, but you can imagine stepping in as CEO and during the pandemic and January of 2021. Let me just put all of that in context, right? And my day 3 was the insurrection, right? So let me just say that first year, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then sophomore year, if you remember kind of using that analogy, high school, college, you're like, okay, I'm kind of making my way. I know a little bit more. And junior year, not that I have complete vision and clarity, but it definitely is bigger than it was, say, 2 years ago. But I'm careful too when I use that analogy because I don't want my board to think, okay, she's going to graduate next year and be out of here. Not at all, right? This is truly a commitment beyond that. But I think when I speak to how's it been, 2020 was a rough year. It was a rough year, right? Not just for myself, but I'm mindful it was a rough year for many. We were still in the midst of the pandemic, trying to figure this stuff out. And so in my case, stepping into the role, there had been an interim CEO for a long period of time as well. So, stepping in, there's instability to some extent, thinking about what is culture, right? My team hasn't been in the office in over, at that point, it had been 9-10 months. Everyone's remote, et cetera. So that first year, and then everyone, with the exception of one person on our executive team, were new. So the good news, and sometimes I hear CEOs say, hey, it's lonely. I've never had the lonely experience. I have an incredible executive team and extended senior leadership team, and then all Ticers who have truly been supportive on this journey. But the first year, I will just say, because of not just tides and all that was going on, was a challenging year, right? And thinking about where we were as an organization, I say this and I'll give some incredible examples. We had unprecedented growth in 2020. That's a good problem to have. Let me just say we're now, 1.5 billion in assets. It's a great, right? It's not a problem, but it's a great thing to have, right? But our capacity hadn't caught up, right? The growth came, as it should, right? And I shouldn't say as it should, but given the needs of our communities and the role that we play as an intermediary, because I always say this is not a commercial about tides. This is about a call to action for the sector, right? So given all that was happening, really did impact us as an organization. So stepping in is, how are we Tides going to respond to this moment, right? That's what I stepped into, right, in 2020, right, or 2021. Two, the future of work. How are we going to work together, right? This is a 47-year-old at the time, 45-year-old organization, strong culture, primarily with folks being here in San Francisco and in New York, right? We're now all remote. What is that going to mean? Well, what I would say now is incredibly excited. We have staff now in 25 states. We opened it up. We want change makers. We want folks who are committed, right, to social and racial justice. And you don't have to be in the Bay Area in New York to do this, right? But I say that because there were a lot of moving parts. Let me just say that. And then, of course, the dynamic of establishing rapport with your board, love my board. So if any of my board members are on here, let me just say, couldn't do this work without their support and sponsorship, which is important. But also, it does take time to kind of understand where your board is. And given all the changes that have been going on with the organization, we definitely had to kind of establish some new norms in terms of how we were going to partner. So it wasn't as if I stepped in and guess what, let's just keep rocking and rolling. Not at all, right? But I think the organization was ready. Let me just say, in terms of this organization, and we are unapologetic about being progressive in our values and our beliefs and in our work. The team here has been incredibly welcoming. And on top of all the work we were doing, we also embarked on this strategic planning journey with Bridgespan, which really now has informed a different path forward, or at least building upon what's great, a new or renewed path forward. But it was an interesting, challenging year. And then I'm also mindful as a Black woman, I don't ever undermine the significance of what this experience was as a Black woman stepping into this role, right? Sometimes we don't want to talk about that. Well, no, I have an incredible network of other Black women CEOs of social justice nonprofits here in the Bay Area and beyond. And so we get together and have that heartfelt conversation of what does this mean for us? So I'm not the first Black woman CEO of Tides, I'm the second. But I also understand all that's been going on. 2021 was an interesting year, you know what I mean? And so with that came interesting experiences that I had. Microaggressions are real, those happen everywhere. So.
Well, I will testify to the strength of that particular network, because many of them emailed me as soon as we started talking that we were doing this. Like, oh my goodness, that's so great! I love Janiece. We get together all the time, and whatever. So yes, it is a vibrant network, and many of them have joined us. I am going to read a question directly from the Q&A, because it is. I would normally not read something directly, but I would also tell you that very rarely would I ever think that I could say something better than Cheryl Dorsey has said it. So I will read what Cheryl put in the post specifically. She said, Janiece and Craig love this conversation. I didn't really need to read that part, but I just wanted to. Anyway, I love that acronym, Goya. I agree. In some ways, though, it speaks to the inertia we're seeing after the racial reckoning. Despite the billions in verbal pledges made to move money to BIPOC or communities, the data shows that very little of that money has actually moved. What do we do about that? What forms of accountability are required? Or precisely, how does the social impact infrastructure need to shift to allow that money to actually move? Possible I've just asked you the $1 million question that is unanswerable, but what do you think about that, Janiece? Responses to that?
Yep. So thank you to Cheryl. So I'm hopeful she heard the shout out early on. And let me just say, Cheryl, I actually have some of your data right here in front of me too. What I can speak to is the way we Tides are approaching it, but we're hopeful that as we embark on this journey, that there will be some new/best practices that we can share with others as well, right? Some of that is in terms of holding companies, donors accountable, is to have the real conversation, right? And so as we, I mentioned, are now embarking on this new path of shifting power, it starts with us having those conversations with our donor partners, with the companies in particular, about where are you on this journey, right? And having the data, right, to inform. Now, there are some who are going to say, oh, I didn't know. I'm not to say I'm going to give them a pass, right? But I think there is this conversation, there's this courageous conversation that needs to happen about here's where we are and where are you on that journey, right? Two, I think I'm one about transparency. So I do think we need to apply, and I don't know if pressure is the right, in terms of ongoing visibility of what is indeed happening in this space in terms of that funding, right? So the great news is I'm very familiar with Cheryl's report and the data, right? But are others as familiar, and how do we consistently keep telling that story, right? In some cases, we know who these companies are. Now, I'm not saying we're going to put them on the cover of New York Times, but I do think there's this authentic ongoing conversation. Because Craig, as you said too, folks, I don't want to say have apathy, but they move on to the next thing. In some cases, they move on to the next thing because they weren't authentically bought in anyway, right? They weren't authentically bought in anyway. And there are some who don't really have the appetite for system change. You know what I mean? So I do think that some of this is about us continuously, to the extent we then start going to talk about something else, let me tell you, we're definitely not going to see more than 1%, right? But I do think if we really are committed, and those of us, and there are many of us who are, that it does require us, one, to collaborate, right? So I have some information, data, Cheryl has some, I can go down the whole list, you know what I mean? Nicole Taylor, our friend at Silicon Valley Community Foundation, I mean, there's a list of folks. I think it does require all of us to continuously share and make sure this information, and to put that, I don't know if pressure, this just maybe influence is a better word, right? On these partners in terms of their giving strategies and their investment strategies.
Yeah, no, I think very true. And I think it's interesting too to watch people, as they kind of move on to the next issue, in some ways it's like it's all the same issue on some level, right? Like it's all interconnected, and it's all like, yeah, okay, you think now you need to focus on climate. Like, well, let me tell you why climate actually intersects with the racial issues you thought you should have focused on a year ago, right? Like, so it's all kind of ties together. But want to shift a little bit. So big, very different roles, right? So what you're doing at Fossil, what you're doing now, what are the biggest differences between, you know, working at a corporation, giving away money, sort of working at this sort of behemoth philanthropic organization that's doing a lot of things, including raising money? What's been the biggest difference for you?
So it's interesting that your perspective is that my job was giving away money. When I was at Fossil. I think my job was a little different than just giving away money.
Probably.
However, I say that with humor, is because I know a lot of folks too are like, oh my God, I had no idea this work is that hard. Is there more no's than yeses, right? When you're leading a corporate philanthropy function or any function where the perception, hey, that you're giving money. And I was always clear that it was not about giving away money. It was about investing, social investments, right? And so I even wanted to do away with the whole term philanthropy or corporate foundation. It really was about social investments. So I actually say there are some aspects of what I do, and maybe that's because of my own why, that are very similar, you know, and I say that because I often share at Tides, it starts and stops with people, right? And so I see my role as being one of inspiring others to be a part of this change. That's what I did when I was at Fossil, whether it was, you know, internal employees, but more importantly, partners. And I think that's part of my role here, right? Is inspiring our team and inspiring others, right? To be a part of this change. So my job in that case, very similar. How I show up, very similar, right? So if you knew Janiece then, you know the same Janiece now, right? What I will say though, in this work, I've never had the kind of anxiety that I sometimes have now until moving in this space. And I say this because I can't turn this off. I don't turn this off. That's probably not good. So in terms of self-care, let me just say, you know, as I'm getting better in terms, but this is also my personal why. This is not a job for me, right? The work that I'm doing. And I say that on behalf of many of us at Tides, and especially in this moment, right? This is too important work. And I know on the other side of every dollar that goes out of Tides is a person, is a life that's being impacted, right? So that's where this is different than, say, when I left Fossil is going to be in business forever. Let me just say the work is going to continue, and they're still doing amazing work, and I'm in close contact with folks there. But the call to action there is very different than the call to action here as a CEO, and especially in this moment. So that's where I think it's very different for me, right? Is where I sit now in the ecosystem, and the opportunity and the obligation that I have in terms of this work and leading this organization in particular.
And it's an interesting thing that you say there, because like I would probably observe, and very fortunate, I get to be around a lot of leaders all the time, but like the best ones, like they've always been doing the same job. They're just in different seats where maybe they found a different place and a different way to influence it. But like I was doing the same thing my whole career, just now I'm in this role as opposed to that role. So I think that's a really great point. And then, you know, as you intimated, and as I said at the beginning, but let's probe a little bit more of like, I really did believe that you were doing philanthropy at Fossil in a very different way than other corporations that I had experienced. So despite my describing your role as giving away money, which definitely sold it short, talk to me a little bit about that. Like, why did you do it differently? And like, how was that, like, what were the conscious choices you made to do it differently? And what do you think other corporations or the sort of corporate giving sector can look at and sort of learn from what your experiences were at Fossil?
Yeah, it's interesting because my intent isn't to do different just to do different, right? If I go back to how I'm wired, coming from Silicon Valley, I'm always looking at solving problems. I'm always looking at how do we create sustainable solutions, et cetera, right? Even when I was on the business side. So that's part of how I'm wired. So if I see a good practice out there, nothing makes me happier than adapting or adopting a good, if not great practice, right? If I do see something though that's broken or not working or doesn't exist, I think I'm wired, how do we do this different or better? And so as we talk about corporate philanthropy, I think there's some good practices out there, and there are some that are not good. And so even when I, was hired at Fossil, I wanted to understand where they were on their journey and what type of work did they want to do. If it was just giving money, as you said before, then again, I'm not your person, right? If there's a real appetite, right, in terms of looking at, and at the time, we didn't know what our what was going to be yet, but if you're really thinking about this being a catalyst or being a catalyst of change in some meaningful way, and and it's also important on the corporate side of in terms of self-enlightenment, you should identify a giving strategy or a social investment strategy that aligns with the company's competencies and why, right? So thinking about who Fossil was, I was incredibly excited about figuring out what made sense for Fossil in terms of who they were and how they operate and their industry. So if you're looking for that type of social impact, then I'm your person, right? And so as we then built out the foundation, good news is, like I said, had a lot of thought partners already in the space. And had a lot of folks who were truly informants. So let me just say that. So, I'm always one too. I wouldn't say I love consultants and everything, but I do love bringing in other perspectives. And so our belief at Fossil at the time was truly about how can a company, quote unquote, really be engaged in system change. And so that's where we landed on social entrepreneurship early on, is that we, believed in the paradigm, right, of social entrepreneurs in terms of how they create change and thinking about, using what works and doesn't work in terms of the practices of entrepreneurship to create solutions for social issues. So I think that was part of kind of creating something that may look different, may have been different in some cases, is that one, I did definitely have a clean slate from the CEO and the board to create something that was going to be really meaningful. As well. And so, thinking then, we didn't use the term trust-based philanthropy. What I already knew is that there were some practices out there that are incredibly heavy for nonprofits on the receiving end, right? Especially smaller nonprofits, and especially smaller nonprofits led by people of color. So one of the practices that we put in place immediately is I said, you guys, I don't want us, quote unquote, to put practices in place that require a 10-page proposal. Don't even want a 5-page proposal, right? Put the due diligence on us, right, to understand who's doing what out in the space, leaning on partners like Echo and Green. So Cheryl will remember, if you've been vetted by an Echo and Green, guess what? I know that bar is high. So I already know, right, that they're operating at a certain level. If you've been vetted by a DRK or SCO or a bunch, so we had really strong partnerships with Echo and Green, Ashoka, and a bunch of others. They've already passed a certain threshold. We don't need them to jump through more hoops. Instead, let's see if there's mission alignment in terms of youth empowerment. The practices we put in place at the time around measurement. Don't want a 20-page report on the back end in terms of evaluation and measurement, right? Instead, we want them to be doing the work, right? We want these organizations to be doing the work. So, and I'll use this as an example. So I don't know if anyone on here is from Gates. If they already have a Gates grant or certain organizations, and you know what the requirements are from an evaluation perspective, by all means, we're good. And you can list a bunch of incredible organizations out there, but I said, give us a subset of that. You don't have to create a separate evaluation report on the back end for us. So I say that because those were some of the, I think, things that were different, Craig, about how we were approaching strategic philanthropy, is not trying to create more bureaucracy, not trying to burden, but how do we really become a true partner? One of the things that my team and I created up front is I said, let's not call them a grantee. Don't want to use the term grantee. Let's talk about partnership. But what does partnership mean? This is not the hierarchical, right, model where, hey, we're the donor, you're the grantee, we give you money, and hence, no. What does it mean to truly be a partner, right? And so those were some of the other practices that we had put in place.
Excellent. And definitely, having at that point worked with Peer Forward before you came on the board, but where you were a donor first, and that was the experience as an organization that was being funded there. You never felt the way you do with others. But I do want to flag one thing just for our team. I think it was at the 41-minute mark where Janiece said, "I love consultants." So if we want to kind of clip that, but I want to get to some of the questions that came in on the chat. One sort of dovetails right where you just were in terms of impact. How does Tides kind of measure its impact, right? How do you think of, as you said, progress is slow, but how do you measure that you are making the progress that you want to make as an organization?
Let me just say, I think in that case, we're on a journey. And so we are right now redefining our impact model, given our new North Star, right? So as I shared with you and this audience, right, the new direction of shifting and strengthening power is new for us. So it's not on the website, but you will see it. You will see some of that language, doers and donors, and our approach in terms of supporting proximate leaders show up on our website very soon. Well, there's a little bit of that on there, but the new North Star is what we call it, will show up soon. So we are right now reimagining what is the right impact model, the right impact measurement model to align with this new direction, right? So I can't say right now, how do we know yet, because it's actually under development. In the past, as with any organization, right, we had different evaluation approaches, et cetera, reports and all the stuff that I've been talking about. But now we are completely reimagining what that should look like. One, such that it is truly aligned with the needs of proximate leaders and communities, right? So as we talk about trust-based, or something, hopefully we'll replace that term, looking at what is the right evaluation approach that aligns with that, given this new chapter for Tides as well.
Excellent, very helpful. All right, another one here in the Q&A, and actually Tides really interesting. I'm guessing now that I think about it, that had to be about a year ago. We had a friend, Aisha Alexander, on a conversation just like this, and we talked specifically about this idea of like, how do you motivate more donors of color, right? Because you think it's like, donors get on boards hire leaders hire staff, and like you kind of get into this loop of, of white guys, right? So if you start back at the sort of donor perspective, like this question is, how is Tides thinking about, informing and inspiring donors of color to use their philanthropy more strategically and sort of just, I guess, engage more in the sector? Is that something Tides is focused on or thinking about or working on?
Yes, and so that is under development. And let me say, it's incredibly important, right, to our team. It's incredibly important to me, and personally as well. And so even as I, now, like I said, entering my junior year at Tides, as I talk to even personal friends, et cetera, I've had folks go, "Oh, I didn't know you guys do donor advised funds," right? So here are folks in my own, village, so to speak, who have donor advised funds sitting at Fidelity and all over the place. And so the conversation that we Tides will have, right, with donors of color is, if you align, because many of them have their own personal giving strategies, approaches, beliefs, whatever that might be, is one, educating them on kind of what's happening in the field. And then again, this is not a commercial for Tides, but how do you think about your giving differently in terms of system change? And I think some of it is education, but it's also about us being placed in those spaces where we can have those conversations with donors of color. So I will say, there's a host of different forums, right, where donors of color but come together, if you will. But also let's go to, and I don't want to say non-traditional, but let's meet them where they are. So there are some partnerships that we Tides are putting in place where I know it will put us, we'll have access to, quote unquote, folks of color who I know are donating to a myriad of causes. So I think it's going down the paths where there are convenings of donors of color, but I actually want us to go towards the path where the intention isn't necessarily that, but then to have that conversation about social impact, social justice. Because I don't think the conversation is just about, hey, here's giving and philanthropy. I think the conversation is about the why and the impact on the other side, right? And so the conversation I have with folks often, and now I do have them often, is really more about the work. It's about the social justice work. It's about the racial justice work. And then we back into the how, right? But don't start with, hey, if you want to give through, you know what I mean? It starts about the work. So there is a lot to be done, but I also say some of it is education. And so, one of the things many of us should be doing, not just us Tides, but others as well, is let's meet them where they are. And it may not be in the traditional spaces. It might be at all the different convenings of Black professionals, of churches, of fraternities and sororities, different organizations, even, like I said, who do believe in giving, you know what I mean? But how do we engage them in terms of giving in a different, quote unquote, systemic, sustainable way?
One more question from the Q&A here. I was trying to balance of like, what am I most curious about? But I've got to go with what the audience wants to hear, right? So, and I think this is a good one, right? So it talks about like, as more companies are taking on DEI initiatives, research is showing that women of color continue to have more negative experiences at work. What advice do you have for women of color who are navigating these spaces where, I'm sort of reading between the lines here a little bit too, of like, where they're probably starting to be on top of all the experiences they were already always having, they're now probably being put on of like, oh, no, now you need to explain to us, how we can be more diverse, how we can be more equitable, how we can be more inclusive. Like, what would be your advice to women of color navigating kind of the work world today? Yeah, it's just a really easy kind of softball question.
No, it's the last couple of weeks have been personally challenging, as I have personal friends, who have quote unquote had to resign. These are Black women leaders, et cetera. So, when I talk about what we face is in terms of microaggressions and all of that, it's real, right? Even say myself, others who step in, it's kind of like, okay, woo, Black woman's here, she's going to fix it. So that's what many of us have stepped into, right? And whether that was in 2020, 2021, or even prior to, like, oh, you are now expected to fix it, right? So one of the things I say too is, and I always say, you don't have to worry. I myself, if I'm not adding value, you know what I mean? And not just based on my own definition of value, but what my board values, and more importantly, what my team values and what my communities value, I understand why I'm here. And so I will make sure that I'm gracefully transitioned, if you will. But I think, especially, and I understand the corporate space incredible well, and I'm not oversharing, but when I left FOSS, I was the only Black officer in the company. So there was I wouldn't call it guilt, because I clearly knew I was running towards something. I wasn't running from something, but I understood the responsibility and even the implication of that. So when I think about this moment for us, let me say about all of us in this space is the self-care piece is so important, right? Understanding the factors that we're all having to navigate. But I do think right now, whether you're on the corporate side, the nonprofit side, et cetera, is we all have to do a really good job. And it's not a better job, because it's not about us, about making sure we're setting expectations appropriately and understanding why we're being put in these places or spaces. If you're being approached because you are a Black woman, I won't sign up and do it just because I'm the Black woman. Let's make sure that I understand what the needs are, and do I have the skills and experiences to do that? You know what I mean? So I'm really mindful of the optics and the reality, and making sure that the marriage is a good marriage, right? Between the organization and its needs, and then us as Black women stepping into these roles, right? The other thing is it is so important though to make sure in all these spaces, I can't overstate the significance of the mentoring and the sponsorship. I don't care at what level, whether you're at my level of CEO, whether it's my board, somebody, make sure that you have some air coverage and some support on this very challenging journey, right? And a lot of that even comes from outside of your respective organization. I can't overstate the significance. And I know several situations where Black women have moved where they did not have that real sponsorship and support, which is so critical at this time as well. So I'm hopeful I answered the question, because it's not an easy one to answer. Yeah. Not at all.
No, I think that was good, and it's certainly helpful. So yeah, gonna probably likely be the last one. So what are you seeing sort of in philanthropy, the nonprofit sector, that's most exciting to you right now? Like, what's the thing that you're looking at saying, okay, this is exciting?
In addition to tithes.
The answer could be tied. The answer can be tied.
Our direction, but no, I'm excited about our direction and the opportunity to collaborate. I do think there's heightened commitment to quote unquote collaboration right now, and that is one of the things I think, because it is, at least I know the organization we're collaborating with, the funds that we are part of, like the Democracy Frontlines Fund. I am super, in that case, it's one that's focused on supporting Black leaders on the ground in terms of democracy, but the players that are involved are everywhere from McArt. It was led by our sister friend Crystal Haley, who leads Libra Foundation, but the folks at the table may not have come together at the table in the past, right? MacArthur Foundation to Tides to Vibrato to you. I mean, there's a host of us that are around that table, right? So I'm very energized right now about this opportunity of collaboration because I think that's the only way we're going to break through in terms of this real system change that I was talking about earlier. So that is one of the things. I think a lot of folks are checking their egos at the door. And this is about, okay, what we've been doing has gotten us moderate success, but how do we really now look at the next chapter being something significantly different as it relates to social and racial justice?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think this sense of collaboration, I'm seeing more pooled funds than ever before. I'm seeing more sort of large scale donor collaboratives than I've ever seen before. I'm seeing even just more philanthropists and philanthropies talking to each other than I've ever seen before. So that's all very exciting. All right. I really want to thank you for spending the time with us. I want to thank everybody who tuned in. Everybody who tuned in, you'll get a copy of the recording. We're going to try and do these about once a quarter. We've got lots of interesting people lined up. So hopefully you'll be with us again. But Janiece, I just want to say again, thanks for being here. Thanks for sharing your time and everything with everybody. But I'd also say, you know, you're just one of those people that when I see your name out there, it makes me smile because I know something good's probably happening. And I'm so excited to see you in this role and was just really privileged to be able to share you with some of our community here. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right. We will talk soon. Take care.
All right.
Thanks.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.